Have you ever felt the chill of whispers passing through your tent in the dead of night? Or seen ghostly lanterns floating through dense pine forests, their soft glow revealing secrets never imagined by mortal eyes? From guttural chants beneath oak trees in Bavaria to ghostly cameras that expose your deepest fears, their journeys will leave you wondering what really lurks in the shadows. Stay with us until the end to discover every chilling detail. And if you're ready to explore these haunted realms together, be sure to subscribe, and so you don't miss a single moment of the unknown. Leave a comment to let us know which story gave you the chills, and don't turn out the lights just yet. Story 1. My name is Sophia Müller. I'm 29 years old, and I'm a freelance translator in Berlin. In the summer of 2022, after weeks buried under deadlines and revisions of medieval manuscripts, I decided to make a solo getaway into the Bavarian countryside. I have always been fascinated by ancient ruins and the stories of peasants and alchemists, so I decided to camp near an archaeological site I stumbled upon on local history blogs. That Monday, August 15th, I arrived at dusk and pitched my tent beneath towering, twisted oaks, breathing in the scent of moss mingled with damp earth. I carried only the essentials: a sleeping bag, a first aid kit, a powerful flashlight, and my notebook, where I jotted down snippets of old Germanic dialects I had found in manuscripts. My plan was to spend just 3 nights there, study the atmosphere of the place in situ, and rest far from the urban chaos. Everything seemed perfect. The birdsong, the gentle wind rustling the leaves, even the last rays of sunlight staining the sculpted stones in red and ochre. I felt at ease, knowing that the trail to the ruins was relatively easy, and that if anything happened, my phone still had reception. On the first day, after exploring the jagged stones that remained of an ancient monastery, I returned to camp, hungry and tired. While cooking instant noodles over the small improvised fire, I noticed trembling branches around me, but I chalked it up to the wind. I zipped up the tent around 10 p.m. and, before sleeping, I noted my first impressions. Magical place, but I feel as if someone is watching me. My notebook lay open atop my backpack, illuminated only by the weak flashlight I had left beside it. The texture of the pages seemed damp, almost muddy, as though the night itself had seeped in. I woke in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat and with my heart racing. Between 2 and 3 a.m. I heard a distant murmur, like voices singing in a guttural, monotonous tone. It was archaic German, words I had never learned in old language courses, mixed with something that sounded almost ritualistic. I wrapped the comforter around myself and peered through the tent's seam. Shadows danced among the trees, cut by orange flames from torches stuck in the ground. Curious and terrified, I gently pushed aside the zipper and slipped out without making a sound, following the echo of that strange song. The grass was soaked from the afternoon's rain, and my footsteps sank into the soil, leaving a trail I would never manage to erase. When I approached the circle of torches, my heartbeat leapt. There were 12 wooden stakes aflame, each about 3 meters apart, forming a perfect geometric pattern. But when I looked at the ground between them, searching for footprints or any human trace, nothing. The sodden earth showed no sign of shoes or boots, as if that ritual were being conducted by ethereal presences. I held my breath, smelling burnt chamomile tea in the air and hearing the wind whisper through the foliage. A chill ran down my spine, and at that moment the wind shifted. The torches flared higher, as if lifted by invisible hands, before extinguishing in a single gust. Shock was too mild a word for the lump in my throat. It was then that I decided to retreat, not daring to look back, and I ran back to the tent, questioning my sanity with every step that drenched my sneakers. On the second night, my sleep was pierced by a dry crack, like bones snapping somewhere in the darkness. I checked my watch, 1:47 a.m. The silence felt heavy, and then I heard a dragging whisper, distant at first but growing nearer. Reflexively, I reached for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, a chorus of voices embroidered in medieval German echoed, louder than before. It was as if dozens of shadows were chanting around me. I put on my jacket and peeked outside. There was no light source, only oak trunks casting strange silhouettes. My stomach churned when I realized that, this time, no circle of torches existed, but the rhythm of the voices was identical. Consumed by curiosity and fear, I decided to follow the sound around the camp. My steps sank in the mud, leaving clear tracks, but I didn't care. I needed to understand what was happening there. I passed under a giant oak whose roots looked like claws ready to snatch me, and I spotted a moonlit clearing. In the center were two small stones aligned like an improvised altar, covered in white lichen. The voices stopped abruptly, as if someone had pressed a button. I held my breath, but heard only my own heart pounding, until I felt a shiver. The altar had been wiped clean, as if someone had erased symbols I hadn't even seen. On the third night, I resolved to record everything. I placed my digital recorder near the tent entrance and went back inside, zipping it closed. My plan was to capture at least a snippet of the chant and decipher the archaic words. At 2:15 a.m., the recorder picked up a distant thunderclap and then the guttural murmur. I dashed to the door, but when I pulled the zipper, I realized something had bent the track, as if an invisible hand had tried to jam it. The voices stopped, and a cold wind blew so hard it extinguished my external lantern. In the pitch black, I felt something slide down my arm. I gasped in fright and switched on the flashlight to see nothing. When dawn finally broke, my sleep was fragile, haunted by dreams of featureless faces and empty eyes. I hesitantly emerged from the tent and noticed something placed beside the entrance. A handful of dry leaves tied with a strand of dark hair. I looked at my notebook in the backpack and saw scrawled in my handwriting a phrase I didn't remember writing. They never sleep. A shiver ran through my legs as I examined the leaves, feeling their rough texture. My instinct told me it was time to leave. I gathered my things, left the recorder inside the tent, and followed the trail back to the car, my heart still hammering. The moment I felt the dry foliage in my backpack, my pulse skyrocketed and I ran to the car, abandoning any trace of courage I still possessed. I tripped over knotted roots, cut my hand on a branch, and ignored the warm blood flowing down. It didn't matter. I just wanted distance from that place. I managed to unlock the door with trembling keys and flung myself into the driver's seat, my legs shaking so badly I could barely close the door properly. The engine sputtered hesitantly, as if protesting my presence. I glanced in the rearview mirror and thought I saw a shadow standing at the edge of the clearing, but when I blinked, there was nothing but dew-speckled trees. Before I could even pull out of the muddy clearing, I noticed an object stuck to the windshield, the tip of a white handkerchief discreetly crumpled, lodged like a distress note or a threatening message. The scent of dried lavender, identical to that of the leaves, filled the car and squeezed my lungs. I tore the handkerchief off immediately, folded it with shaking hands, and tossed it onto the back seat, too afraid to touch it again. As I shifted into reverse, a cutting wind swept the cloth out the window, as if an invisible hand was pulling it back, but the car pulled away with enough force to finally, rip it free. On the dirt road ahead, my headlights illuminated only a few meters, and the silence was so oppressive that I braked before each turn. Suddenly, my radio crackled, and for a second I heard a guttural melody I immediately recognized as part of the chant from the previous nights. My blood ran cold. It was that same, dragging, insistent tone, coming through a channel I would never tune into. I switched off the radio with my numb thumb and floored the accelerator, itching to change the dial, the road, anything, except that sound etched into my bones. When I finally saw the yellow glow of a gas station up ahead, an absurd relief filled my chest, as if I'd escaped a waking nightmare. I parked under the lamp, trembling, and stepped out cautiously, glancing back with every step. The attendant, a man in a camouflage jacket, looked up from behind the counter but said nothing about the white handkerchief still in my hands. I handed over my credit card without making eye contact, wishing with all my might for the place to be full of mundane life. But deep down, I knew that night had dissolved any normalcy I once had. The next day, I woke at home to the distant sound of my familiar alarm clock echoing through the walls, as if from another life. Berlin's sky was clear and cloudless, but I felt enveloped in an inner fog. I called the historian friend who had recommended the campsite and told her everything in a trembling voice, from the guttural chant to the hair-tied handkerchief. She listened in silence, only saying, "That sounds disturbing," before advising me never to return and to hand over my recordings and notes to a local folklore expert. The following week, I delivered the recorder and some pages from my notebook to a professor at the University of Munich who researches forgotten pagan rituals. He examined the recordings and commented that there were passages of invocations adapted from 12th century manuscripts, but with improvised variations, almost as if someone were reenacting an ancestral tradition, resurrected out of curiosity or devotion. I asked if it could be dangerous, and he gave a half smile. The past only becomes harmless when we stop trying to awaken it. I still think of that night under the oaks as a threshold between what is real and what should be respected in silence. I keep the white handkerchief in a sealed box beside the recorder. Whenever someone asks me about my Bavarian adventure, I smile and respond, cautiously, without revealing every detail. After all, part of the fear lives in what we don't tell. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I still hear the distant chant echoing in my subconscious, reminding me that there are secrets no rite should expose. Today, I have learned to value the fine line between academic curiosity and respect for the echoes of the past. I will never return to that campsite, but I carry with me the story that no one will ever fully believe. And if you found this account strange or terrifying, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and whether you've ever felt a chill run down your spine reading something so uncanny. Story 2. My name is David Santos. I'm 34 years old, and I'm a full-time travel video maker. In the winter of 2023, after months working on beach and desert videos, I decided to take on something different, capturing the solitude of frozen forests. On February 12th, I took my camper van, affectionately nicknamed Loba Branca, and headed to the Caparaó Mountains, where tall pines stood like icy sentinels. That afternoon, I parked on a small plateau covered in soft snow, surrounded by trees laden with crystalline frost. My plan was to film the sunset reflecting off the white field, and then spend the night inside the van with my thermal blanket and a mug of hot chocolate. Everything promised to be a peaceful night, but my headlights were already casting long shadows between the trunks, and a hissing wind was stirring the branches in an almost melodic way. While I was adjusting the camera on the tripod, I felt a different kind of chill, not the usual cold, but as if the air itself carried a strange weight. Snow was falling in large, slow flakes, covering my footprints almost before I finished making them. I shot a few takes of the twilight sky, dyed burned pink until the snap of a branch interrupted the forest's silence. I thought about recording the sound, but the crack was so loud that it squeezed my heart. I waited for an echo, but nothing came except that dry snap. I noted in my audio recorder, branch breaking, but no animal in sight. Later, when the snow began to thicken into a dense blizzard, the world outside went blank except for the beam of my headlights, which pierced the white curtain. I sat in the driver's seat and listened. The only sound was the wind scraping against the metal door, and suddenly, another crack. Much closer this time, like someone stepping on a log buried under the snow. I knew I should stay inside the van, but the videomaker in me refused to ignore that call. I grabbed the flashlight, pulled on my thermal boots, and opened the door, feeling a blast of frigid air invade the warm space I had created. Outside, the snow reached up to my ankles, and the silence seemed to conspire against any sound I made. I walked toward the spot where the branches had snapped, my boots leaving clear tracks in the snow. But to my surprise, where I expected to find fox or deer tracks, I saw deep, perfect arcs carved into the snow, as if enormous circular claws had gouged the ground. The arcs intertwined, leading toward a frozen lake whose dull sheen looked like a cracked mirror. I was only a few meters from its edge when, through the flashlight beam, I noticed distorted reflections dancing beneath the ice, shadows that didn't match my own movements. I heard the high-pitched crack of ice under my feet before I realized I had ventured several meters away from the shore. Each step made the lake emit deep creaks as if it were groaning in pain. The flashlight trembled in my hand, casting bouncing shadows under the translucent white surface. About 3 meters ahead, I saw something pulsating below, a scarlet glow that moved slowly, tracing undefined shapes. My body froze for a moment, and that was all it took to slip on a smooth patch of ice. I fell onto my back, the air rushing out of my lungs in a quick gasp, and I felt my heart nearly leap from my chest. I scrambled up, my boots gouging lines into the hard snow, and looked toward the center of the lake where the arcs converged. That red stain continued to pulse, sometimes farther away, sometimes closer, as if taunting me to come nearer. Every time I blinked, I saw distorted reflections, long hands, stretched faces, and eyes glowing in intense red, trapped in the ice's transparency. The sense that something living and hungry was watching me was inescapable. My instincts screamed at me to run, but curiosity and the thirst for unique footage kept me there, crouched like a cornered animal. When I finally managed to turn back, the wind rose in a shrill whistle, carrying snowflakes that stung my face. I ran back along the arcs, trying to keep my balance, but the drawings in the snow seemed to have shifted positions, creating new patterns pointing at me. It was as if the lake itself were guiding me to some unknown destination. Solid ground never seemed so far away. The trees cracked behind me, and I thought I heard heavy footsteps matching my frantic pace. I reached the camper van with my body aching and my lungs burning. I slammed the door so hard I heard the thud echo through the blizzard. I climbed inside and locked everything, feeling the warmth of the engine still throbbing beneath me. I turned on the heater, covered my legs, and tried to steady my breathing, but the radio crackled and emitted a high-pitched hiss before briefly tuning into that same guttural chant I had heard among the trees. I switched everything off at once, letting the silence fill the space as my hands shook so violently I could barely zip up my thermal coat. In the morning, I stepped out of the van only to check for damage up front. A branch was wedged between the windshield and the hood. As I removed the debris, I noticed the semicircular grooves in the snow outside persisted, as if silently inviting me to return. A chill ran up my spine. I had never seen such precise and yet alien marks. I closed the hood with a firm slam and decided there was no reason to stay any longer. I went back inside, packed up my cameras, and began driving aimlessly, leaving that treacherous clearing behind. With every kilometer I drove, the sky seemed to press the van closer to the ground, and the radio stayed silent, as if the storm had wiped out all frequencies. My body trembled even more than on that terrifying night. I couldn't tell if it was the cold or fear consuming me. I thought about seeking shelter at an inn farther down, but the thought of bringing those marks with me made me accelerate even more, as though fleeing would erase what I had witnessed. When I finally found an isolated station by the main road, I pulled in exhausted and asked the attendant for a strong coffee. With each sip, I tried to discern whether it had all been the product of my tired mind or if something was truly lurking in the frozen forests. The man looked at me curiously when I described the grooves and the reflections under the ice, but he shook his head. "Just your imagination, friend. This place is nothing but snow." His skeptical tone irritated me, but perhaps he was right. Perhaps I had projected my insecurities onto that inhospitable landscape. I returned to the road and didn't stop until I was close to home. With the first houses appearing on the horizon and human lights re-emerging among the trees, that's when I realized I no longer saw those grooves in the snow, as if the path I had taken simply ceased to exist. The fear gave way to a reluctant but solid relief. Reviewing the footage at the editing suite was a shock. In the scenes where I walked toward the lake, I noticed slight color distortions, as if the image flickered for fractions of a second, revealing silhouettes moving beneath the snow. In the clip where I fall on my back, instead of just slipping, there was a reflection of something, a dark shape, that vanished in the next frame. My stomach churned. It wasn't just faulty memory. I really had captured something. I sat at the desk, eyes glued to the monitor, knowing I had to decide what to do with that material. With only a few details left to finalize, I decided to seek help from a sound engineer friend. We discovered an ancient chant mixed into the radio static, but with nuances that sounded like muffled human voices. He advised anonymizing the audio before sharing it to avoid panic, but also warned that old rituals could attract unwanted attention. At that moment, I felt the weight of responsibility. My video wouldn't be mere entertainment, but a warning about the secrets hidden in frozen landscapes. I then decided to produce a mini documentary about the experience, interweaving my footage with interviews about local Caparaó legends, emphasizing caution and respect for nature. At the end, I included a direct message to viewers. If you venture into winter forests, pay attention to the signs. Nothing is as it seems beneath the white surface. That was my way of turning panic into learning, offering a practical conclusion that might save someone from following my footsteps too faithfully in their curiosity. When I released the video on my channel, I received messages from people reporting similar phenomena, some even with records of semicircles in the snow and strange lights under the ice. I realized my story was part of something larger, a mystery that still insists on persisting. Today, I keep my footage stored away and only revisit that mini-documentary, occasionally reminding myself that however capable we are of capturing the world, there are ancient forces that prefer to remain hidden. Story 3. My name is Elena Ribeiro, I'm 31 years old, and in March 2024 I decided to isolate myself to write my first novel. I set up my canvas cabin on a plateau, surrounded by enormous mountains, satin-lit by the setting sun. I brought only the essentials: a case of fountain pens, a hardcover notebook, a small camping stove, and provisions for a week. The view was breathtaking, but there was also something inhospitable about that place so far from any road or civilization. In the early afternoon, I arranged my workspace by one of the canvas windows, from where I could watch the dance of clouds between the stone towers. As I sketched out dialogue and descriptions, the sound of the wind was my only companion, mingling with the occasional caw of crows circling above the trees. The shadows of the pines stretched across the dry grass, and each gust made the canvas resonate like a hollow drum. For a few moments I felt that this isolation would be the best way to dive into my imagination without distractions. When the sun began to set, I noticed something extraordinary. Pale lanterns suspended in the air, floating slowly above the treetops. They were small, aged metal lanterns with brittle-colored glass and engraved designs that resembled runes. The light flickered, casting colorful reflections among the dark trunks. My heart raced, and a tingling ran down my arms. There were no smoke trails, no people nearby, just those still lanterns, as if they were alive. Shortly after, I heard light footsteps circling the cabin, a whisper of steps on the fine, stony sand. Each step seemed to orbit around me, starting at one point and returning to the same spot, never straying from the canvas. I found myself gripping my pen tightly, my gaze fixed on the window. The sound was rhythmic, almost musical, as if a silent dance were taking place. Around me, in the deepening darkness, only the delicate clink of something dragging, perhaps tiny chains, perhaps old cutlery moving across the ground, remained. As night deepened, the whisper of footsteps merged with a sharper rustle, as if something were dragging time-corroded chains. I mustered the courage to pull aside the side canvas and light my interior lantern. The white beam cut through the darkness, revealing shadows dancing among the trunks. But when the light hit the ground around me, all I saw were grains of fine sand and little pebbles, no human or animal silhouettes. Still, the sound did not cease. Light steps traced a concentric pattern, ever tightening, as if they wanted to envelop me until I became part of that circle. I felt the air grow heavy, charged with a subtle metallic odor, as if something rusted were being heated by the moon's embers. In a rare moment of silence, I noticed a distant tinkle. It was delicate, almost melodic, as if cutlery were clinking against each other. The sound encircled my position, and my mind tried to find logical explanations. Wind blowing dry branches or reflections in the floating lantern's glass. But the tinkle persisted, steady and measured. Fearing that the movement would draw too close, I stepped back to the center of the cabin and extinguished my lantern, leaving only the faint glow of the suspended lanterns to filter through the canvas panels. My heart hammered so loudly it threatened to drown out the outside world. When the darkness peaked, I decided to remain still and observe. I leaned my back against the wooden plank that served as the base of my makeshift bed and focused. From inside, the tinkle seemed to envelop every inch of the perimeter, as if a banquet of cutlery were being dragged inexorably toward a single point. My throat went dry when I felt an icy breath slip through a seam in the canvas, extinguishing the faint glow of the lanterns. It was then that for a brief second, I saw an undefined reflection, something resembling a slender arm covered in pale skin, cross the glass of one lantern before disappearing into the blackness. Dawn broke with an atrocious silence. Unbuttoning the cabin door, my gaze fell upon a macabre spectacle. Hundreds of small pieces of cutlery, rusted forks and knives of varying styles and ages, were scattered in a perfect circle around the canvas. Each piece pointed its blade or prongs toward the center, as if participating in a consecration ritual. The morning mist curled among the rocky peaks, lending an almost sacred aura to the scene. My stomach churned as I noted that the lanterns no longer floated. Only the echo of the tinkle remained etched in my memory. When the clock struck midnight, the wind died down and the silence became almost tangible. I sat at the small wooden table, notebook open and pen poised over the page, unable to continue my novel. Each time I lifted my gaze, I saw those lanterns swaying outside, now close enough that I could almost reach them through the window. The yellowish light cast long shadows on the packed earth floor, like outstretched fingers pointing toward me. A shiver ran down my spine when I realized there was no sound of crackling wood or spinning compasses, only the silent ballet of floating lights. I decided to venture out and investigate despite my racing heart. I donned my waterproof jacket, pulled on my hiking boots, and gripped the lantern as if it were a shield. I unzipped the canvas, and a cold gust mixed with the scent of pine enveloped me. Just ahead, among the slender trunks, I followed a trail of small circular footprints left in the damp soil. They looked like depressions made by heavy objects, but no metal or stone fragments indicated what had formed them. Each step I took echoed in the valley, yet the lanterns danced with no visible master, guiding me like ethereal puppets. I continued along that trail of marks until I noticed the first break of dawn painting the sky in shades of gray and lilac. I returned inside the cabin to retrieve my notebook, intending to jot down my impressions, but I spotted something strange on the ground. Hundreds of rusted metal fragments, like cutlery torn and twisted, scattered in all directions. Each tiny fork or spoon was positioned with its point aimed directly at my cabin, forming a sharp mosaic that made me hesitate. The rust filled the air with a strong metallic odor, and the ground felt as though it pulsed beneath my feet. The shock paralyzed me for a few seconds. I gathered chipped spoon handles and held some in my palm, feeling their rough edges scratch my skin. Was this human handiwork or something supernatural? There were no additional footprints, only the objects complicit in the mystery. My mind spun with hypotheses, forgotten rituals, macabre pranks of passing travelers, or something I would never explain in words. Carefully, I boxed up the ceramic lanterns in an improvised container, vowing to study each engraved symbol and understand what the pieces were trying to communicate. The next day, I awoke with the sun filtering through the cabin's fabric and the weight of the rusted cutlery in a makeshift box beside me. I decided I needed help deciphering those symbols and researching any records of ancient rituals in the region. I packed my belongings, placed the metal pieces carefully into sealed plastic bags, and dragged the cabin to the car, feeling every rock beneath the uneven ground. I headed to the nearest village, a community of a few dozen stone houses, and went straight to the local tavern, where the scent of bread and hot cheese felt like balm. I showed the contents of the box to the innkeeper, an elderly man with deeply lined features, and asked to speak with someone who knew the region's legends. He nodded and called over an elderly woman dressed in traditional garb, who examined the cutlery with wide eyes. She then told me about the Children of the Peaks, ancient spirits who, according to oral tradition, collected everyday objects as offerings and positioned them like arrows to indicate that they were watching someone from the outside. That explained the razor-sharp arrow pattern I found, but not the floating lanterns or the sound of footsteps, details she attributed to enchantments designed to attract the curiosity of bold outsiders. With my heart pounding, I thanked her and returned to my portable cabin, armed with a new perspective. That night, I prepared an offering, small wildflowers and a vial of pure water, arranging them carefully at the cabin entrance. As soon as dusk swallowed the valley, I lit one of the ancient lanterns and hung it from the lowest branch of a nearby pine, exactly where I had felt most watched. The following night, when the moonlight bathed the valley in a silvery glow, I returned to the clearing where I had hung the lantern. Everything was silent, no tinkle, no breath, only the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze. I lifted the lantern and, in its dim reflection, noticed something I had missed before, a symbol carved into the pine branch, identical to the runes on the cabin's frame. I touched it with my finger and felt the rough bark give way, revealing an ancient design, like a seal of passage. In that precise moment, I understood. That place was not expelling me, it was merely accepting my presence into its mysteries. The next day, I packed up the cabin and lanterns, stowing each rusted piece of cutlery in a sealed bag. As I drove down the hill, I felt a mix of relief and nostalgia. I knew I might never find another valley so alive, so guardian of secrets. At the end of the dirt road before reaching the asphalt, I stopped the car, got out and looked back. The mountains formed a silent, imposing stone portal, as though telling me that that chapter of my life would remain sealed there. Months later, I published my novel, titled Runes of the Silent Valley, dedicating it to all who dare to listen to what nature has to whisper. At book signings, some readers asked if the story was purely a product of my imagination. I never revealed everything, but I smiled, knowing that the truth resided both within the pages and in the space between the mountains. The canvas cabin became a newspaper feature and sparked curiosity among other writers, but no one ever showed the courage to return there. Today, as I write my second book, I still sense the scent of pine in my dreams and hear the distant echo of a clinking cutlery, reminders of a night in which reality danced with the supernatural. And whenever I need to find inspiration again, I close my eyes and let that remote valley guide me back to words. Story 4. My name is Liam Costa. I'm 27 years old, and I've been living in England for 5 years, working as a graphic designer and creator in my spare time. On September 8, 2023, I fueled up the motorhome, affectionately nicknamed Erebo for its dark gray color, and drove to a lake hidden among cliffs covered in moss and lichen. I parked at the water's edge facing the emerald reflections of the reeds, set up my recording station, and while the sun stained the sky orange, I prepared a vegetable stew for dinner. By then, everything felt idyllic. The gentle lapping of waves along the shore, the distant cry of seagulls, and the soft creak of the motorhome door hinges. The next morning, I awoke to the piercing call of a bird beside the windshield. I opened the window to breathe the damp air and felt something unusual. Fine, interlaced scratches snaked along Erebo's side. Leaning in, I read inscriptions that looked Celtic, angular symbols and curved lines forming disjointed words that I vaguely translated as ancestral blood and victim of the moon. My stomach tightened. This was clearly a marking, as if someone centuries ago had left a message for whoever was brave enough to listen. I spent the day trying to decipher those symbols, photographing every detail with my high-resolution camera. With each discovery, I shivered. Some symbols resembled runes of sacrifice, while others looked like maps of routes through nearby marshes. But my need for video content kept a thread of rationality. Who would inscribe such messages on a modern vehicle? Still, I stored the images and resumed my outdoor recordings, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching me from behind the bushes. When night fell, I closed the blinds and prepared to edit my footage. That's when I heard the first clink of chains, a metallic dragging sound coming from the marsh bordering the lake. My heart raced and I dashed to the door. Through Erebo's window, I saw hooded figures in dark woolen cloaks moving slowly through the mud, dragging rusted chains that sparkled in the moonlight. They marched in unison and chanted a guttural lament in an indecipherable tongue heavy with ancient pain, causing the glass to vibrate with each breath of voice. Hearing their lament made my blood run cold. I gripped my phone in my right hand and silently recorded the ghostly procession. The chains struck the muddy water, and the clouded glass intensified the rhythm of sound like a sinister drum echoing in my chest. I tried to step closer, but every footfall on the motorhome's floorboard sounded too loud, and I feared alerting the cloaked figures to my presence. I turned off the interior lights and, aiming my camera through the window, watched them circle Erebo in a near ritualistic arc. One figure paused beside me, bowed its hood forward, and for a brief moment our gazes met. Two vitreous, lifeless eyes reflecting the moonlight with a gray sheen. My body froze, unable to look away, and the lament carried words that seemed to bite the air. Ancient blood, awaken the legacy. The glass trembled with a sudden crack, as if about to shatter. Heart pounding, I stepped back from the window toward the main door. Every muscle urged me to flee, but I knew a sudden move might draw unwanted attention. Meanwhile, the hooded figures continued their slow march, completing the circle around the motorhome before dispersing into the marsh, vanishing among the reeds that shimmered under the moon. When the last of them disappeared, silence reclaimed the place of the lament, leaving only the distant echo of chains. I cautiously switched on the interior light and locked every door and window. My pulse still thundered, and the air felt too heavy to breathe. On my phone screen, I saw that I had captured the moment the hood inclined toward me, irrefutable proof that I hadn't imagined it all. Still, the question echoing in my mind was the same. Who or what would remain there, watching Erebo while I sought answers? The next morning, I awoke to the distant clink of metal on metal, but this time from inside the motorhome itself. When I drew back the curtains, I saw rusted chains draped over the sofa, as though dragged there by invisible hands overnight. The metallic odor in the air had grown more intense, and the Celtic inscription on the exterior seemed to pulse in the pale dawn light. Trembling, I recorded every detail in my field notebook: the depth of the freshly gouged marks, the direction of the chains, and the pattern scratched into the floorboards. I decided it was time to leave, but something prevented me from zipping the door closed. Each time I tried to pull the latch, I heard a distant whisper, almost a contralto chant, murmuring ancient words that seemed to compel my body to stay. I forced my hand, took a deep breath, and on impulse yanked the door open. The engine roared, and the interior chains swayed as if lamenting my departure. I dashed outside, abandoning backpacks and cables, too afraid to look back until I heard the engine engage. Hours later, on the main road, I stopped at the visitors center of an archaeological park. I showed a researcher photos of the inscriptions and video footage. He frowned as he examined the details, explaining that the I words ancestral blood referred to an ancient, perhaps non-human pact, sealed by those who guarded the boundary between the world of men and the world of spirits. According to him, the lamenting chants and chains marked a punishment for anyone daring to profane sacred territories. When I finally returned to Erebo to gather my belongings, I found a handful of waterlogged earth mixed with small bone fragments on the hood, evidence that something had happened there while I sought answers. I closed Erebo's door with a definitive slam and left the valley behind, carrying with me not only images and notes, but the persistent echo of the lament that had made my windows tremble. The rest of the day was consumed by a vague urgency. Whenever I parked at a viewpoint to photograph the cliffs, my eyes were drawn back to the inscriptions, as if they still pulsed beneath the cold metal. I avoided touching the marked area, but I couldn't resist tracing the ancient grooves with my finger, feeling their rough relief and the echo of unspoken words. With each kilometer, memories of the hooded figures circling Erebo chilled my hands, even under the warmth of the late morning sun. In the afternoon, I sought refuge in a rustic cafe atop a bluff, trying to gently reorganize my thoughts and review my footage. When I opened the photo gallery on my tablet, I noticed that in several shots there appeared a dark smudge crawling along the motorhome side, a strange blur visible only when I zoomed in. My stomach churned again. It wasn't a cloud's shadow or dust on the lens, but something solid, with an indefinite outline, seeming to follow my journey. At dusk, I decided to stay at a smaller campground surrounded by gentler cliffs. I parked Erebo in an isolated spot, switched on the interior light, and attempted to make dinner. But every utensil I touched, a spoon, a knife, a fork, rang with a faint metallic tinkle, reminding me of the chains from the previous night. I glanced at the side window. No hooded figures, but my shadow's reflection kneeling to pick up a utensil was oddly elongated, as though more than my own body were there. As I heated the pot, the onboard radio crackled and, for a moment, broadcast that same guttural lament I had heard by the marsh. I froze, spoon poised in midair, staring at the campervan's antenna, wondering whether the sound originated from the frequencies or another dimension. I dared not cut the power for fear that absolute silence would invite something even more disturbing. I remained motionless, awaiting the next sign that the ancient pact still lived beneath my travel route. When night fell again, I rigged a makeshift ceiling fan to dispel the heat emanating from Erebo's metal walls. I lay down but couldn't relax. Every time I blinked, I saw a hooded figure reflected in the mirror by the wardrobe, though none stood outside. I switched on my handheld flashlight, sweeping the beam through the space, and found only my own trembling reflection in the glass. Yet the distant sound of chains returned, this time paced as if dragging a heavy burden slowly down the vehicle's narrow corridor. Determined to capture the sound more closely, I quietly got dressed over my pajamas and slipped on sneakers, avoiding the scattered objects on the floor. I opened the door cautiously and pressed my ear to the threshold. The noise came from the rear, where I kept my suitcases. I flicked on the flashlight and, to my horror, saw chains hanging on the shelf, swaying gently as if newly inflicted there. The links' ends were worn and stained with a rusty red that seemed too fresh for mere age. Panicked, I tried to pull the chains down, but they were firmly embedded in the wood, as if hammered in by invisible hands. A chill ran through me when I noticed, behind the tangled metal, a discreet inscription. A circle with 3 vertical lines like a symbol I'd photographed on the motorhome's side. That familiarity made me even more uneasy. It was as if I were trapped in a self-feeding cycle. The runes appeared wherever I least expected them. Heart racing, I staggered back inside and slammed the door shut. I sat on the floor against it, rummaging through my backpack until I found the audio recorder. I decided to capture the heavy silence of the space, hoping to detect any hiss or whisper beyond what my eyes could see. I held down the record button and, playing it back through headphones, heard a low whisper in a mix of languages. "Let not the pact die." I sat motionless, feeling those ancient words reverberate in my chest. At 3 a.m., a sharp knock sounded on Arabo's side door, as if someone wanted entry. I trembled and for a moment considered fleeing, but curiosity overpowered panic. I peered through the peephole, nothing but darkness outside and my distorted reflection staring back. The knock came again, this time with a metallic scrape, as if something was clawing at the frame. I held my breath and, using the weakest flashlight beam possible so as not to be seen, illuminated the minimum. Through the window crack, I spotted rust streaks oozing down the vehicle's side, thin lines that hadn't been there before, as if the chains had bled iron into twisted grooves. A bitter taste filled my mouth, and I wondered if it was all reality or a delirium born of exhaustion and fear. I decided to record a bit more, holding my phone to the glass, capturing the storm's wind outside mixed with a distant echo of chains, a lament seemingly reenacting the pact. When dawn finally broke, I stumbled outside and inhaled the swamp's cold air. The interior chains now lay strewn across the floor, each link gleaming as if someone had oiled them overnight. On the countertop, the Celtic inscriptions reappeared, this time formed by the iron wire itself. Words I could only partly decipher: "Watchful Guardians" and "Eternal Price." The fear gave way to cautious resolve. It was time to break the bond. Summoning strength I didn't know I had, I grabbed a loose piece of furniture and began striking the embedded chains, attempting to pry them from the boards. With each blow, I felt a low tremor, as if the entire motorhome vibrated in protest. On the 5th strike, a sharp crack echoed, and the chains clattered to the floor in a heavy, cold tangle. I flung the door open and hurled the chains away, heart pounding as the ancient pact seemed to shatter. I even saw one last rune shimmer on the scattered metal, a reminder that, though freed, Arabo and I would never be completely rid of that legacy. Even after casting the chains far from Arabo, I felt the air lighten, as if an invisible veil had been lifted. The runes still glowed faintly on the bodywork, but no longer pulsed like an ancient heart. I touched the marked area cautiously and found only cold, smooth metal. A strange relief washed over me, tinged with a hint of sadness at closing that mystical chapter of my journey. I climbed back inside, started the engine, and slid down the marshy path, leaving the lake and green cliffs behind. Each kilometer seemed to dissolve the tension, but my thoughts remained tethered to the hooded lament. I knew I might never fully decipher that ancestral heritage, but I would carry the weight and beauty of that experience with me. Back in civilization, I parked Arabo in a rented garage and cleaned the chains, storing them in a locked chest at the back of my closet. I planned to use them as set pieces in future films, but something held me back from reviving that dark ritual. I decided to leave them there, untouched, so no one else could break the ancient price sealed in that valley. In the following weeks, I reviewed the recordings and incorporated snippets of the lament into a documentary about Cornwall for my channel. I concluded with a cautious narration. Some places are not mere landscapes. They're guardians of ongoing pacts that, once awakened, demand their price. The video garnered thousands of views, but every viewer comment felt distant against the memory of lifeless eyes and chains clanking under the moon. Even today, when I revisit those scenes, I hear the silent summons of those ancient marshes and understand that certain boundaries should not be crossed by the unprepared. The next morning, I awoke to the first rays of sun filtering through Erebos' seams. The fresh air brought an almost supernatural relief, as though the vehicle itself sighed alongside me. I stepped out and, for a moment, stared silently at the valley. The lake shimmered peacefully, with no chains in sight and no cloaked figures drifting through the reeds. It was then I understood that, though broken by my hands, that pact still depended on the memory of the local guardians, and that my curiosity had finally honored at last the boundary between the world of the living and the ancient. I packed up carefully, leaving only a note pinned to Erebos' door. "I respected your legacy and apologize for the disturbance," scrawled in black ink. Before closing the motorhome, I splashed some lake water over the Celtic inscriptions, smearing the symbols and erasing on the cold surface any trace that might draw another curious soul. A weight lifted from my shoulders, as if the metal itself shed a spiritual rust. As I engaged first gear, I saw through the rearview mirror a discreet figure at the marsh's edge, a hood bowing in a brief gesture of acceptance. My heart tightened, but I quelled my fear, knowing that, at least for now, balance had been restored. I followed the road down, leaving behind Erebos, the chains, and the lament of the ancients, carrying with me not only stunning images, but a lesson in reverence for the mysteries that dwell in forgotten places. When I finally reached civilization, I shut off the engine and sat for a few minutes, absorbing the silence of the parked vehicle. In that moment, I knew my journey would never be just another video. It was a testament to something greater, an invitation that, whenever we explore the unknown, we must always carry the reverence of those treading on sacred ground. Story 5. My name is Aiko Tanaka. I'm 28 years old, and I've been a street photographer in Tokyo for 5 years. In the autumn of 2024, after weeks of shoots and tight deadlines, I decided to escape the urban noise and take shelter on a remote farmstead in Nagano, where old rice paddies mingle with cedar forests. That Friday, October 10th, I arrived at dusk carrying only my backpack with minimal gear, 2 analog cameras, black and white film rolls, and a notebook. I pitched my canvas tent beneath a dense canopy of trees, knowing that absolute silence reigned there, broken only by the rustle of leaves. As soon as my makeshift torches died out, I wrapped myself in a thermal blanket and waited for total darkness. Minutes later, everything was so still it felt almost tangible, the silence that comes just before sound. That's when I heard the first whispers, fragments of voices full of despair, like cries muffled by the wind, in an ancient tongue. The tone was melancholic, almost poetic, echoing among the trees, and it compelled me to leave the tent, the photographer's instinct hunting for a new scene to capture. With my camera around my neck, I moved forward slowly, guided by those murmurs to an old stone courtyard. There I discovered a macabre labyrinth of completely burned paper lanterns, shattered frames leaning against each other, forming corridors of former smoke. The lanterns varied in size, but all bore blurred inscriptions, characters I didn't recognize. Every step made my heart pound, because the ground was covered in hot ashes, and lifting my foot sent a strange heat through my heel. At the center of this lantern maze, I caught my breath when I spotted a pile of vintage cameras, box models, rangefinders, even yellowed Polaroids, arranged in a circle like offerings. I approached cautiously and, upon lifting a Lomo LCA, saw that its film had been automatically exposed with an image. My own pale face, hollow eyes, and a rigid smile. A chill ran through me. I hadn't pressed the shutter. Each camera showed a different shot, all featuring that same portrait of me, but with subtle variations. Sometimes the gaze was skewed, sometimes the mouth curved into a forced half-smile. A crackling snap jolted me behind. I raised my camera to capture movement, but saw only branches stirring, though there was no wind. The melted lanterns seemed to conceal distorted figures in the shadows, and I felt watched from every angle. The whisper swelled into a low, dragging moan, as if those original voices lamented seeing my face there, transformed into photographic testimony of a forgotten ritual. I dashed back to the tent, my boots sinking into a pool of ashes mixed with water, feeling the ground give beneath me. I studied the faded inscriptions on the burned lanterns through my lens, trying to decipher them. Some lines looked like, "Do not return," or "Remember us." But everything was so blurred I could barely trust what I read. With trembling hands, I zipped up the canvas and set up a tripod with a recorder, hoping to capture those whispers and perhaps glean a clue to the ritual's origin. During the small hours, I awoke to the sound of film rolls being wound inside the tent. When I switched on my flashlight, I saw that my two previously empty cameras now held fully exposed rolls, dangling from the tent pocket like death knells. I gripped the equipment and, mentally developing the film, realized that the printed images began to fade in the flashlight beam, as if they were alive and resisting revelation. Silence reclaimed the night, but the emptiness felt heavier, as if the very darkness had swallowed my breath. At daybreak, I emerged in shock to find dozens of lanterns hanging from the cedar branches, empty, swaying gently. On the ground lay hundreds of negatives scattered like visual clues. My feet, my hands, my body leaning over. Gear, but always without a face. A photographic void contrasting with the automatic exposures of my pale visage. I gathered everything into a plastic bag and left without looking back, the echo of those ancestral moans still imprinted in my mind. Days later, I developed one of the old rolls in a lab and, to my horror, discovered that the face in the photos wasn't exactly mine. It was an ethereal, translucent version with faded skin and eyes fixed on some point beyond the camera. I realized I hadn't just fled the city, but something that pursued me, a lost memory that, through my lenses, found a way to resurface. Since then, I carry a living lesson. There are secrets that the flash should never reveal, and sometimes it's safer to remain in darkness than expose your own face to the chance of the past. In the weeks that followed that night, I woke in a sweat, heart pounding, compulsively rereading my notes. Every line scribbled in my notebook brought back the smell of ash and the echo of ancestral moans. I replaced my main analog camera with a more discreet digital one, thinking perhaps the manual mechanism disturbed the balance of that place. But the truth was, nothing seemed to free me from the photographic presence that had somehow possessed me. I decided to return to the remote site armed with a sturdy tripod and a video recorder to document the cutlery, lanterns, and cameras. I wanted to discern a pattern among the exposed images. They all showed pale faces, but with each development the pallor grew, as if my life force escaped gradually from the portrait into the burnt lantern frames. Upon arrival, I found the lantern maze almost entirely washed away by rain, and the cameras, now soaked, hanging from branches like plastic bats. As I tried to dry one camera body, I felt something vibrate in my pocket, one of the negatives I thought safely stored. When I pulled it out, it bore a close-up of my eyes, yet this time there was no face, only a dark void, like an open portal within the photographic frame. The image seemed to pulse under the morning sun, inviting me to look more closely, even though each glance made me fear what my own essence might become. Then I understood that the ancient whisper wasn't mere ambiance. It was a summons. Sitting beneath the cedar, I began to hear fragments of words carried on the wind. Return. Complete. Free us. An order echoing in my subconscious. My instinct screamed to flee for good, but a part of me, driven by a thirst for answers, hesitated to abandon that unfinished mystery. Still guided by the voice in my mind, I watched the lanterns around me reignite at sunset, though I hadn't touched a switch. Their outlines glowed in yellowed hues, casting trembling shadows on the leaf-strewn ground. I noticed that with each spark, the burned frames gained new patterns. Inscriptions once blurred now stood out clearly. There I read, "Forgotten photographer, echo of the gaze," and "Preserve the reflection." Heart pounding, I walked among those corridors of dead light, feeling the weight of each click I had taken that fateful night. The cameras dangling in the trees seemed to pivot slightly, as if we were accomplices in an act we didn't fully understand. I tried to switch each one off, but the metal ring around the lens was so cold and smooth my fingers slipped, unable to turn the ring. In desperation, I gathered the negatives strewn across the damp ground and tried to burn them in the makeshift fire by the tent. The flames licked the photographic paper, but instead of consuming them, it made them hiss and pop, sending black sparks flying in my direction. I grabbed the entire bundle and, with one final heave, hurled them deep into the trees. A gust of wind blew at that moment, extinguishing the burned torches and leaving only a greenish flash blinking in the branches above. Then complete silence fell upon me. The lanterns failed, the cameras swayed one last time, and nothing moved after. A wave of relief washed over me, mingled with silent sorrow, because I knew that photographic echo, though contained, would never fully disappear. Night descended into full darkness, and I gathered my gear, aware that I had broken only a fragment of the spell. With firm steps, I left the labyrinth of charred memories behind, carrying a void that only those who dared to look closely at their own face could understand. When I returned to the city, I felt the concrete and traffic's thick air like a familiar embrace. Yet each time I looked through the bus window, I saw brief reflections of my pale face in the glass, as if the lanterns and cameras had left an invisible mark on me. I stored the bag of negatives and equipment in the dark closet of my studio, but dared not use them in any new project. Every click seemed to carry the weight of those ancestral whispers. In the weeks that followed, my street photography changed. My images, once full of vibrant life, took on long shadows and cool tones, as if I still wore Nagano's veil. Colleagues remarked that my portraits looked like mirrors of solitude, and that sometimes in dark corners of the photos, one could make out subtle traces of lanterns or blurred silhouettes. I decided to organize a small exhibition titled Echoes of the Gaze, featuring analog and digital photographs that narrated my experience, from the ash fire to the camera labyrinth. At the vernissage, I left an empty space on one wall, a frame without a photograph, inviting viewers to see their own reflection in that void. It was my way of sharing that sometimes the greatest mystery we capture is ourselves. Today, I continue clicking through Tokyo's streets, but with a flicker of caution and reverence. I always carry a blank film roll in my pocket, never knowing when ancient whispers might invite me once more to explore shadows and lanterns. And above all, I've learned that the true spectator of a photograph is the one who dares to face their own reflection, even when it seems distant and pale.